The Neanderthal problem is an ongoing debate in paleoanthropology that has not been resolved in 150 years. The traditional story is that they were a separate species, a side branch, biologically distinct, who occasionally interbred with modern humans in rare moments of contact. But when you actually lay the evidence on the table, genetics, reproduction, physiology, and the inconvenient way fossils refuse to stay in neat categories, that story starts to look less like science and more like a preference, or a theoretical need to keep them separate. Because the more we learn, the more the boundary dissolves. Neanderthals were not almost human. They were human, not just in the sentimental sense, not just in the cultural sense, but in the hard biological sense. They carried mitochondrial DNA that is modern human-like in its placement within the human tree. They carried Y-DNA that was not some alien system, but part of the same kind of lineage structure that modern humans have. They shared blood group systems, ABO in particular, meaning the same biological immunology existed on both sides. They produced fertile offspring with Homo sapiens not only once but repeatedly across enormous spans of geography and time. Their DNA is not one accident in our genomes. It is a persistent layer inside the bodies of billions of living people. At some point, a serious person has to ask, if all of that is true, what exactly are we claiming when we call them a different species? Because species is not a sacred word. It is a tool, one that exists to describe reality. If the tool fails, it should be replaced, not defended. The truth is that the Neanderthal-sapien separation was never as clean as textbooks wanted. It was always an overlapping population system, different regional expressions of the same broader human metapopulation, diverging in some traits through isolation, and then repeatedly reconnecting through gene flow. Neanderthals were not the Martians of Ice Age Europe. They were a Western Eurasian human population with a distinctive package of anatomy shaped by climate, drift, and long local continuity. When Homo sapiens populations expanded into those regions, what happened was not the meeting of two different species like horses and donkeys. It was the meeting of two human populations, different but compatible, with enough biological overlap that interbreeding was not an exception. It was part of the story. And here is the point that detonates the whole different species narrative. If you transported a Levantine Homo sapiens from 100,000 years ago into a modern anatomy classroom, they would not look like a modern European. They would look archaic. They would look heavy. They would look Neanderthaloid. Yet we still call them Homo sapiens, not some separate species. We already accept that human anatomy can be very different across time while still being the same species. We accept it because it is convenient to do so for fossils we emotionally want inside the modern category. But when it comes to Neanderthals, suddenly the rules change. Suddenly the same anatomical range that is tolerated inside Homo sapiens becomes proof of separateness for Neanderthals. The classification becomes inconsistent, selective, and frankly political, a boundary built not from biology, but from storytelling. This is why the claims of one British paleoanthropologist who writes that the physical traits of Homo sapiens include a high and rounded, globular brain case and a relatively narrow pelvis are so misleading when used as a wall between populations. That statement can be true as a rough tendency in living humans, but it collapses as a hard diagnostic rule the moment you bring fossil humans into the conversation. Globular brain case is not a magical stamp that divides humanity into clean species boxes. It is an anatomical trend that intensified over time, and it varies across human fossils in ways that blur the edge. Many early Homo sapiens do not present the hyperglobular vault associated with recent humans, and some fossils often placed in the modern human category show mixed profiles, modern in some regions, archaic in others. Meanwhile, Neanderthals, although famous for their long, low cranial vault, also contain variation, and the story becomes even messier when you examine hybrid zones and fossils like those from the Levant, where Neanderthal and modern traits interpenetrate. This is why using a single cranial shape descriptor as a species boundary is not science, it is rhetoric. Now consider one example often cited, Amud 1. If we are honest, Amud 1 is one of those fossils that makes the neat narrative sweat. Amud 1 is classified as a Neanderthal, yet it possesses traits that don't cooperate with the crude caricature of a squat, brutish, biologically alien creature. Amud 1 had a very large cranial capacity, larger than the modern average, and its overall physical presence is not the short, hunched, caveman stereotype. In fact, he is tall and gracile, and yet he has some of the typical Neanderthal features. And Amud 1 is not alone. The entire Levantine corridor reads like a contact zone between overlapping populations rather than two sealed species. The fossils form a gradient, not a fence. The fact that some Neanderthals are almost indistinguishable from early Homo sapiens is proof of their closeness. That gradient is exactly what you expect from populations that diverged locally but were never completely isolated and then later interacted repeatedly. Species boundaries do not behave like that. Species boundaries are not fuzzy like smoke unless you are forcing a classification scheme onto a reality that refuses to match it. This is the deeper issue. Neanderthals do not look like an extinct species that lived in total reproductive isolation. They look like a population with local specialization. Cold adapted body proportions, robust limb bones, distinct facial architecture inside a wider human system. Even their classic traits are not magic lines. A broad nose, mid-facial projection, robust postcranial skeleton, these can be responses to environment as much as ancestry. A narrow pelvis as a sapiens trait sounds impressive until you remember that pelvic anatomy is influenced by body size, locomotion, obstetrics and climate. Human pelvic shape varies substantially even today across populations and sexes, and fossil humans across 300,000 years show even more variance. To turn pelvis width into a species barcode is just not biologically serious. And the same goes for globularity. Modern humans today tend to have a globular vault and reduced brow ridges, but that modern cranial configuration is the endpoint of a long evolutionary smoothing process, not an ancient identity badge. In other words, modern human anatomy is not a single template, it is a moving target through time. Early Homo sapiens were not fully modern. They were closer to archaic humans in many respects. That is why the phrase early modern exists at all. It is an admission that the boundary is transitional. But once you admit transition within Homo sapiens, you've already demolished the most common argument for keeping Neanderthals outside Homo sapiens. Because if archaic sapiens can be sapiens, then Neanderthals can be sapiens too. Now bring in genetics, and the separation becomes even harder to defend. The presence of Neanderthal ancestry in modern humans is not a trivial thing. It means viable hybrids entered the gene pool repeatedly and left descendants. But more importantly, it means the genetic distance between these groups was not remotely like the distance between fully separate mammalian species. In animals, when you have truly distinct species that rarely hybridize, the hybrids are often sterile, weak, or genetically costly. Yet Neanderthal ancestry persists, which means it was not universally harmful. Some of it was selected against, yes, but that is exactly what happens when different populations merge. Some variants are incompatible, others are useful, and most are neutral. That is not a species argument. It is a population genetics argument. And blood types matter here more than people realize. Neanderthals had human-recognizable ABO variants, and that is a huge sign of shared underlying physiology across immune function and biological interactions. Blood group systems evolve under selection pressures, and their persistence across lineages implies deep continuity in the same kind of biological world. It undermines the intuition that Neanderthals were some biologically separate category of creature. This is why the separate species story increasingly looks like a holdover from the pre-genetic era, a time when classification was based mostly on bone shapes and on cultural prejudice about who counts as us. Which brings us to the second problem, the attempt to exclude culture from species classification, as argued by an anthropologist from the British Natural History Museum, who asks, But what about the archaeological evidence that is also commonly cited in favor of uniting the Neanderthals with us as homo sapiens, that they had cultural behaviors such as burying their dead and painting designs on the walls of caves? Well, interesting as that is, it should be excluded from the biological classification of species, since behaviors are potentially more plastic, evolve more quickly, and spread more easily within and between species than traits based on anatomy and DNA. In addition, demonstrating that a past human species had a particular behavior is sometimes difficult to establish from the archaeological record, the well-known paleoanthropologist concluded. At first glance, this sounds cautious and scientific, but it is not neutral, it is strategic. It is designed to remove the strongest evidence of Neanderthal humanity from the conversation by redefining the rules of the conversation. Because here's the problem. We already use culture and behavior as part of what separates modern humans from archaic humans in practice. We do it constantly. We do it implicitly, even when we pretend we don't. Why is Homo sapiens called behaviorally modern at some point? Why do archaeologists treat symbolic behavior, ornamentation, complex burials, long-distance exchange networks, and art as modern? Why do those behaviors matter so much in identifying modern humans in the archaeological record when bones are absent? Because in our own lineage, culture is not a cosmetic add-on. Culture is one of the most significant adaptive systems humans possess. It is how humans survive in environments where anatomy alone is insufficient. If you exclude culture from classification only when Neanderthals show it, then you are not being rigorous. You are protecting a boundary. And the claim that behaviors are more plastic and spread easily within and between species is also a double-edged sword, because if behavior spreads between species, then Neanderthals should not be downgraded for sharing cultural traits. In fact, that would be a sign of deep contact and compatibility. But even beyond that, many aspects of human culture do not spread like tools. Symbolic systems, social complexity, ritual behaviors, and art are not like borrowing a spear-tip design. They reflect cognitive architecture, social learning, and long-term tradition. Even if cultural evidence is harder to interpret, it cannot simply be dismissed when it undermines a preferred species story. This is especially true because the same anthropologists who want to exclude Neanderthal culture from species classification often use culture as the defining essence of Homo sapiens. They want the benefits of the culture divides sapiens from Neanderthals argument when it helps isolate modern humans from archaic humans, but they want to shut it down when it threatens to unite Neanderthals with modern humans. That is not consistency. That is boundary maintenance. The honest position is this. Classification in human evolution has always been a mix of anatomy, genetics, geography, and behavior. It is unavoidable because humans are not like beetles. Behavior is part of our biology. Culture is not separate from the human organism. It is one of the ways the human organism expresses itself. Our brains evolved for culture. Our children evolved for long learning periods. Our vocal tracts evolved for language. Our social brains evolved for coalitions, rituals, and symbolic identity. Neanderthals would have sat around the campfire, telling stories, teaching children about the stars and about the animals and their ancestors. To pretend culture is irrelevant to biological species in humans is biologically absurd. Culture is not just something humans do. Culture is part of what humans are. And once you accept that, the Neanderthals become impossible to keep outside the circle, because they were not silent animals with a few accidents of tool use. They had complex tool industries that lasted tens of thousands of years. They shared Homo sapiens inventions such as the chattel-Peronian tool industry. They wielded fire, built shelters, mastered harsh climates. They had regional traditions. They used pigments, wore clothing, feathers, and ornaments. They were master woodworkers, stoneworkers, had knowledge of medicinal plants, and understood the properties of wood and minerals. They didn't only live in hilltop caves and hunt megafauna. They lived in lakeside camps, in dense forests, in open woodlands, and camped by the ocean and the sea. They dove for clams and ate snails, hunted birds, collected berries and nuts, and dug for tubers. They had complex language because the anatomy, the social complexity, and the archaeological record all point toward structured communication. They cared for injured individuals for long periods, an astonishing behavioral signature of social obligation. They buried the dead in the fetal position, which indicates some kind of meaning attached to death, whether symbolic or social. They would have shared many of our destructive tendencies as well, including conflict, territorialism, and superstition. If we call those behaviors irrelevant, then we have to strip Homo sapiens of its defining feature too. But we won't do that, because the entire structure of human evolutionary storytelling depends on culture being meaningful. So the exclusion of culture in the Neanderthal debate is not truly scientific. It's a rhetorical maneuver to keep Neanderthals in the other category, even when the evidence insists they belong in the modern human category. Now step back and consider the biggest point of all. Neanderthals were not a frozen type. They were not one unchanging species that existed in a biological bubble for 300,000 years. They were a dynamic population system interacting with other humans. The more genetic data arrives, the more it looks like their story is full of gene flow, some from early Homo sapiens into Neanderthals, some from Neanderthals into Homo sapiens, and contributions from other archaic groups as well. This is exactly what you expect when multiple human populations coexist across Eurasia for long periods. They diverge, reconnect, diverge, reconnect again. In that reality, species labels become blunt instruments. That does not mean Neanderthals and recent humans were identical. They clearly weren't. Neanderthals had distinctive anatomy, robust bones, particular craniofacial architecture, and a body plan suited for cold Eurasian environments. But those differences are not automatically species differences. They are population differences, potentially subspecies differences, within a genus that was always more connected than we were taught. And importantly, the fossil record shows that many traits we treat as Neanderthal traits can appear in early Homo sapiens contexts, and vice versa, especially in contact zones. Hybridization does that. Shared ancestry does that. Evolutionary gradients do that. So the claim that Neanderthals were a different species who occasionally interbred collapses under its own contradictions. If interbreeding was possible, repeated, and fertile, then we are not describing two separate biological worlds. We are describing overlapping human populations. If they share deep physiological systems like blood group genes and human reproductive compatibility, then the species label is more about our classification habits than their biological reality. And if early Homo sapiens themselves are acknowledged to be more archaic, more Neanderthal-like and less like living humans, then the idea of using modernity as a species boundary becomes absurd. Because it admits that 100,000 years ago, Homo sapiens were more like Neanderthals than like living humans. And yet we still call them Homo sapiens, which means the argument was never purely biological. It was always about who gets to be called human. The modern evidence is forcing a re-evaluation. Neanderthals are not merely close relatives in a poetic sense. They were part of the human story in a literal sense. Their genes live on, including those that give modern Europeans red hair, freckles, and lighter pigmentation. Their adaptive strategies shaped the success of later populations. Their cultural behaviors overlap with ours. Their anatomy overlaps with ours in the fossil record. The boundary between Neanderthals and sapiens is not the boundary between species. It is the boundary between populations shaped by time, climate, and geography. And once you accept that, the old story flips. Neanderthals stop being the other. They become what they always were, a form of humanity that we met, merged with, and absorbed, not as a rare accident, but as part of our own expansion across the world. In that sense, the claim that culture should be excluded is not simply wrong. It's evasive. Culture is part of biology in humans, and biology itself does not support a clean species separation anyway. Neanderthals were not a separate species occasionally interacting with ours. They were a human population, an overlapping branch of the same long, braided evolutionary stream. And the real problem isn't that the evidence suggests Neanderthals were Homo sapiens. The problem is that for over 50 years, paleoanthropology has resisted saying it because it undermines the total replacement model, the theory that Neanderthals were replaced by a small group of equatorial homo sapiens. Thanks for watching.